Stop scrolling for a second. What if I told you, most of your opinions aren't fully yours? The news you trust, the outrage you feel, the fears that keep you up at night, even the things you think you chose. What if they were influenced step by step, long before you noticed? No secret meetings, no sci-fi mind control devices, just psychology. Because the most powerful people in the world don't need to control you with force. They control your attention, your emotions, your perception of reality. And the scariest part? You help them do it. Tonight, we're breaking down the dark psychological tricks powerful institutions use to influence millions of people every single day. By the end of this video, you'll start seeing patterns everywhere. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Let's begin. 1. The weaponization of fear. Fear is not just an emotion. It is a lever, a switch, a biological override mechanism embedded deep inside the human nervous system. Long before governments, corporations, or media networks existed, fear kept your ancestors alive. It sharpened attention. It accelerated heart rate. It forced immediate decision-making. Run, hide, fight. In survival situations, fear is useful. But in modern society, fear rarely protects you from predators in the wild. Instead, it shapes how you think. And whoever understands that, understands power. When fear activates, your brain shifts control away from the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, long-term planning, and critical analysis, and hands it over to the amygdala, your emotional alarm system. The result? You react before you reflect. You comply before you question. You prioritize safety over freedom. This is not conspiracy theory. It is neuroscience. And throughout history, those in positions of authority have understood something simple. A calm population evaluates power. A frightened population seeks protection from it. Fear compresses your time horizon. Instead of thinking about the long-term consequences of a policy, you think about immediate survival. Instead of asking, "Is this justified?" you ask, "Will this keep me safe?" That subtle shift changes everything. Look at how crises dominate public consciousness. Economic instability becomes the headline of the week. Crime waves are replayed repeatedly on news cycles. Conflict footage loops endlessly. Health scares receive daily case counts, graphs, and projections. It doesn't matter whether a threat is real, exaggerated, or selectively framed. What matters is emotional intensity and repetition. Repetition keeps the nervous system activated. And when a population's nervous system stays activated long enough, anxiety becomes normal. Heightened alertness becomes the baseline. Once fear becomes chronic, people accept things they would otherwise resist. In times of perceived danger, surveillance feels protective. Restrictions feel reasonable. Authority feels comforting. Because fear changes the cost-benefit calculation in your mind. Freedom feels abstract. Safety feels immediate. This is where psychological leverage happens. The most effective use of fear isn't loud or dramatic. It's persistent, low-level, constant. You don't need citizens panicking in the streets. You just need them uneasy, uncertain, concerned enough to stay dependent. And here's the deeper layer. Fear narrows attention. When people are afraid, they focus on the perceived threat. Everything else fades into the background. Complex economic systems, long-term policy shifts, corporate consolidations, subtle legal changes. While attention locks onto the crisis of the moment, structural decisions move quietly behind the curtain. This is not always malicious coordination. Sometimes it is simply opportunistic timing. But the psychological effect is identical. When your focus is captured, your oversight disappears. There is another reason fear works so well. It spreads socially. Humans are wired for emotional contagion. When you see others afraid, your body mirrors it. Social media amplifies this dramatically. Outrage spreads faster than calm discussion. Alarming headlines outperform balanced reporting. Fearful content generates clicks, shares, engagement. And engagement is profitable. So fear becomes incentivized. The more frightened people feel, the more they consume. The more they consume, the more exposure they have. And the cycle reinforces itself. Soon, you are not just responding to threats. You are anticipating them, waiting for the next update, checking for the next warning, living in a state of perpetual alert. But here is the crucial insight. When fear becomes the dominant lens through which you interpret reality, your perception skews. You overestimate danger. You underestimate stability. You begin to see threats everywhere. And when threats appear everywhere, strong authority feels necessary. This is why fear has always been a political and economic tool. In ancient empires, external enemies unified citizens under rulers. In medieval times, spiritual fear reinforced obedience. In modern systems, abstract threats, financial collapse, societal breakdown, existential crises create similar psychological responses. Again, the mechanism is biological, not mystical. Fear reduces nuance. It simplifies reality into binary choices: safe or unsafe, us or them, immediate action or catastrophic loss. Complex conversations disappear. And complexity is where accountability lives. A fearful population rarely demands long debates. They demand decisive action. Now ask yourself, how often are you exposed to content designed to calm you? And how often are you exposed to content designed to alarm you? One builds resilience. The other builds dependency. Because when you feel unsafe, you look outward for solutions. You look to institutions, to leaders, to systems. And the more you rely on those systems emotionally, the less likely you are to challenge them intellectually. That is the weaponization of fear. Not constant panic, but calibrated anxiety. Enough to maintain compliance. Enough to discourage rebellion. Enough to keep attention fixed on immediate danger rather than long-term structure. And here's the most subtle layer of all. Over time, fear reshapes identity. You begin to identify as someone under threat. You bond with others through shared anxiety. Communities form around perceived danger. And once fear becomes part of identity, it is fiercely defended. Because letting go of fear would mean losing belonging, losing certainty, losing the emotional structure that has guided your decisions. That is why fear is so powerful. It does not need chains. It does not need visible force. It operates internally, silently, biologically. But here's the shift. The moment you notice fear rising inside you, not just the event, but the emotional spike, you create space. And space restores thinking. Instead of reacting instantly, you pause. Instead of consuming endlessly, you step back. Instead of asking, "What should I fear?" you ask, "Who benefits from this fear?" That single question disrupts the mechanism. Fear will always exist. It is part of being human. But weaponized fear only works when it is unconscious. When it feels automatic. When it feels unquestionable. The moment it becomes visible, it loses some of its grip. And power that depends on invisible levers weakens when those levers are exposed. This is where control begins. Not in the streets, not in secret rooms, but inside the nervous system. And the battlefield is not territory. It is perception. In the next chapter, we move from fear to division because once fear destabilizes a population, division keeps it fragmented. And fragmented people are far easier to control. 2. Divide, distract, and dominate. If fear destabilizes a population, division fragments it. And fragmented people are easier to control than united ones. Unity is powerful. It creates collective strength, shared goals, coordinated action. But division dissolves momentum. It turns potential allies into opponents. It redirects energy sideways instead of upward. And throughout history, power structures have understood a simple principle. When people fight each other, they stop questioning the system above them. This strategy is ancient. Empires maintained control over vast territories by exploiting ethnic tensions. Rulers encouraged rivalry between regions. Social classes were kept in competition instead of cooperation. Because when groups distrust each other, they cannot unite long enough to challenge authority. But in the modern world, Division doesn't require physical separation. It requires narrative separation, and narratives travel instantly. Today, conflict spreads faster than ever before. A single controversial statement can ignite millions of reactions within hours. An isolated incident becomes a national argument. A disagreement becomes a culture war. And slowly, people begin to see each other not as individuals but as categories. Left versus right, urban versus rural, rich versus poor, traditional versus progressive. Labels simplify complex human beings into opposing camps. And once someone is placed in a camp, nuance disappears. It becomes easier to dismiss, easier to stereotype, easier to dehumanize. This is not accidental psychology. It is tribal instinct. Humans evolved in small groups where loyalty meant survival. Your tribe protected you. Outsiders threatened you. That wiring still exists. When modern narratives frame issues as tribal battles, the brain reacts instinctively. You feel defensive, protective, angry, even if the issue barely affects your daily life, because it no longer feels like policy, feels like identity, and identity is sacred. Here's where distraction enters. When society becomes emotionally absorbed in internal conflict, attention shifts away from structural power. Instead of examining financial systems, people argue about cultural symbols. Instead of analyzing corporate influence, they debate social controversies. Instead of questioning economic policy, they fight over headlines. This horizontal conflict consumes massive energy, time, emotion, focus, all directed at each other. Imagine two groups shouting across a battlefield. They are so focused on defeating one another, they never look up to see who built the battlefield in the first place. Division ensures that no single group becomes large enough to demand systemic change. Because even when people agree on certain frustrations, rising costs, economic pressure, instability, they interpret the cause differently. And if the cause is different, the solution is different. And if the solution is different, unity collapses. Now consider how modern systems amplify this division. Algorithms prioritize engagement. And what generates engagement? Strong emotion, outrage, moral superiority, fear. Content that angers you is more likely to keep you watching, more likely to make you comment, more likely to make you share. So extreme viewpoints rise to the surface. Moderate voices sink quietly beneath the noise. Over time, you are exposed primarily to emotionally charged content. You begin to believe the world is more polarized than it actually is. This is called perception distortion. When you see constant conflict, you assume constant conflict exists. When you see constant hostility, you assume hostility is universal. But the loudest voices are not always the largest group. They are simply the most amplified. And amplification changes perception. Here is the deeper psychological layer. Division activates confirmation bias. You begin consuming information that supports your side. You avoid sources that challenge it. Your worldview narrows. Opposing views feel not just wrong but dangerous. And once you perceive danger, empathy decreases. Dialogue disappears. Only competition remains. This is where domination becomes possible. Because when society fractures into smaller, emotionally reactive groups, coordination becomes nearly impossible. Each group believes it is fighting for justice. Each group believes the other is the problem. And while they battle in the open, structural power remains stable. It is far easier to manage divided factions than a unified population. Now consider another layer of distraction. Outrage cycles are short. 1 week, everyone is furious about one issue. The next week, attention shifts completely. The cycle repeats. Constant emotional peaks. Constant narrative shifts. This prevents sustained focus on long-term structural changes. Deep systemic reform requires patience, organization, and clarity. But distraction fragments attention into reactive bursts. You feel involved. You feel engaged. But engagement is not the same as influence. Posting, arguing, reacting, these create the illusion of participation. But real structural shifts rarely occur in the comment sections. This is psychological containment. You are given an outlet for frustration, a place to express anger, a battlefield to fight on. But the battlefield itself may not be where power truly resides. The most effective domination does not silence dissent. It redirects it, channels it into controlled arenas, keeps it busy, and busyness feels productive, even when it changes nothing fundamental. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How often do you feel anger toward other ordinary people? And how often do you feel clarity about the systems shaping both of you? Division personalizes structural issues. It convinces you that your neighbor is the threat, that a different voter is the problem, that someone with a different lifestyle is responsible for instability. But structural systems are complex. They do not fit easily into viral arguments, so they are harder to debate, harder to package, harder to trend. Division simplifies blame, and simplified blame is emotionally satisfying. But emotional satisfaction is not structural understanding. There is one more psychological twist. When people are constantly divided, they experience social fatigue. They withdraw. They stop participating in public discourse altogether. They detach. And apathy is just as useful as outrage, because an apathetic population rarely organizes, rarely challenges, rarely demands transparency. So whether people are furious or exhausted, the result is similar: fragmentation. And fragmentation prevents collective leverage. Divide, distract, dominate. It does not require secret coordination. It only requires understanding human nature, tribal instincts, emotional reactivity, attention economics. When these forces align, division sustains itself, and the most powerful structures remain untouched. But awareness changes the equation. When you notice yourself being pulled into reflexive anger, pause. When a narrative frames fellow citizens as enemies, step back. When outrage feels addictive, ask who benefits from your emotional investment. Because unity does not mean agreement on everything. It means recognizing shared structural realities. It means resisting the impulse to reduce complex humans into simple labels. It means protecting attention from being consumed by endless horizontal battles. Division is powerful, but it depends on emotional reflex. The moment reflection replaces reaction, the mechanism weakens. In the next chapter, we explore something even subtler: the illusion of choice, because sometimes control doesn't remove options. It simply defines the boundaries of all acceptable ones. And if you never question the boundaries, you never see the walls. 3. The illusion of choice. Control in the modern world rarely looks like control. It looks like freedom, options, customization, personal preference. You choose what to watch. You choose what to buy. You choose who to support. You choose what to believe. Or at least, it feels that way. But here's the uncomfortable question. What if most of your choices exist inside invisible boundaries you never agreed to? Because the most effective form of control does not eliminate choice. It defines the menu. When you walk into a store and see 20 different brands of the same product, you feel empowered. Variety signals freedom. But look deeper. Many of those brands are owned by a small number of parent corporations. The packaging is different. The marketing tone is different. The slogans compete aggressively. But the ownership structure quietly converges at the top. The same principle applies beyond products. Media outlets appear to compete fiercely. Political parties debate loudly. Public figures clash dramatically. And the audience feels represented. But the range of acceptable discussion often remains within a defined spectrum. Certain topics trend. Others disappear. Certain criticisms are encouraged. Others are dismissed as extreme. You are free to argue within the arena. But stepping outside the arena carries social and professional risk. This is where the illusion deepens. Because you are not forced to stay within the boundaries. You simply learn gradually that life is easier if you do. The illusion of choice works because it satisfies a psychological need: autonomy. Human beings resist overt control. If someone directly tells you what to think, you instinctively push back. But if you are presented with multiple pre-approved options, you feel independent. You feel decisive. This mechanism is subtle. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it shapes default pathways. Consider how information reaches you. Algorithms personalize your content. Recommendations are tailored to your past behavior. Search results prioritize certain sources over others. You believe you are exploring freely, but your exploration occurs inside a curated ecosystem. One that learns from you, predicts you, guides you. You choose from what is shown, but you rarely choose what is shown. And what is unseen may as well not exist. This is called invisible framing. If the boundaries of discussion are never questioned, they become reality. You debate policies within the system. You critique leaders within the system. You replace figures within the system. But the structural foundations remain untouched. The game continues, with new players, on the same board. Now ask yourself something difficult. How often do you question the structure itself? Not the candidates, not the brands, not the headlines, the structure. Because structural questions are uncomfortable. They disrupt the illusion of control. They introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty feels destabilizing. So most people remain within familiar lanes. Left or right, brand A or brand B, platform X or platform Y. Debate feels intense, but the underlying architecture rarely shifts. This phenomenon creates psychological containment. You are allowed to express frustration. You are allowed to demand change. But meaningful change is often channeled into pre-existing pathways. Voting cycles, consumer boycotts, trending hashtags, outrage campaigns. These can produce visible shifts, but they often operate within defined limits. The system adapts without transforming. Why does this work so effectively? Because the human brain prefers clarity over complexity. True structural analysis is exhausting. It requires patience, research, long-term thinking, but simplified choices feel manageable. They offer quick resolution. You feel involved. You feel heard. You feel like your decision matters. And sometimes it does, locally, temporarily, symbolically. But symbol is not structure, and appearance is not foundation. There is another layer to the illusion of choice: social conditioning. From an early age, you are taught acceptable ranges of belief. Certain ideas are praised. Others are ridiculed. Some positions are described as responsible. Others as dangerous. Over time, you internalize these signals. You begin filtering yourself before anyone else does. You don't need external censorship. You self-edit. You sense where the invisible lines are drawn. And you stay near the center to avoid consequences. That's when the illusion becomes self-sustaining. You feel free, because no one is visibly restricting you. But the psychological cost of stepping outside the boundaries feels high enough to prevent exploration. The cage is open, but the perimeter is understood. This does not mean every system is malicious. It does not mean every institution is coordinated. It means power naturally consolidates. Resources concentrate. Influence networks form. And once established, systems protect themselves. They adapt to criticism without surrendering control. They rebrand without restructuring. They offer new choices without expanding the boundaries. This is stability through illusion, the appearance of fluid change. Within stable architecture, here is the most unsettling part. You can passionately oppose one option, and passionately defend another, and still never challenge the architecture both options rely on. You feel engaged in conflict, but the battlefield was designed long before you entered it. The lines were drawn, the teams assigned, the rules written. You argue over strategy, but rarely over who built the stadium. This is not about hopelessness. It is about awareness. Because once you recognize that choice can be structured, you begin asking different questions. Not which option do I prefer, but who defined these options? Not which side is right, but what assumptions do both sides share? Not what am I allowed to choose, but what is never presented as a choice at all? The illusion of choice dissolves slowly. It doesn't collapse dramatically. It fades as curiosity expands beyond permitted narratives. And curiosity is powerful, because systems depend on predictability. When people only choose between predefined options, outcomes remain manageable. But when individuals begin questioning the boundaries themselves, control becomes more difficult. Choice is not meaningless, but it is not always as expansive as it appears. Freedom is not simply selecting from a menu. It is understanding who wrote it, and deciding whether the menu reflects your interests or someone else's. In the next chapter, we move deeper into the machinery of influence, because even if you recognize limited choice, your attention can still be captured, your focus can still be engineered, and in a world where attention equals power, whoever controls it shapes perception itself. For dopamine engineering and attention control, there was a time when control required physical presence. A guard, a wall, a visible restriction. Today, control fits in your pocket. It vibrates, it lights up, calls your name, and you reach for it willingly, not because you are weak, but because your brain is wired to respond. At the center of this mechanism is a chemical messenger, dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the pleasure molecule. It is not. It is the anticipation molecule. It drives motivation, curiosity, the urge to seek. When your brain anticipates a reward, dopamine spikes. Not when you receive it, when you expect it. That distinction changes everything. Modern digital platforms are engineered around this principle. Every notification carries possibility. Every refresh might reveal something new. A message, a like, comment, a breakthrough, or nothing at all. And that unpredictability is the key. Psychologists call this variable reward reinforcement. It is the same pattern used in slot machines. You pull the lever. Sometimes you win. Most of the time you don't. But the uncertainty keeps you playing. Because maybe the next pull delivers the reward. Now replace the slot machine with your phone. You scroll. Sometimes you find something fascinating. Sometimes something shocking. Sometimes something that makes you laugh. Most of the time it's neutral. But your brain doesn't know which swipe will deliver the reward. So it keeps swiping. This is not accidental. It is design. Infinite scroll removes natural stopping cues. Autoplay eliminates decision pauses.
Notificacions interrupt quiet moments.
The goal is simple. Capture attention. Hold it. Monetize it. Because attention is the most valuable currency in the modern economy. And whoever captures attention shapes perception. Here is the deeper layer. When your attention becomes fragmented, your cognitive depth decreases. Long-form thinking weakens. Complex analysis becomes exhausting. You grow accustomed to short bursts of stimulation. Quick takes.
Rapid reactions.
Emotional spikes. Instead of sustained reflection. And sustained reflection is dangerous to any system that prefers predictability. When people think deeply, they question. When they question, they research. When they research, they connect dots. But when they are constantly stimulated, they rarely sit still long enough to examine structures. Dopamine engineering creates microdependencies, not dramatic addictions, subtle compulsions. You check your phone without conscious intention. You open apps out of habit. You scroll during silence, waiting in line, before sleeping, after waking. Moments that once allowed introspection now belong to algorithms. And algorithms are not neutral. They learn from your behavior. They track what holds your gaze, what triggers reaction, what prolongs engagement. Over time, they refine your feed to maximize retention. Not truth, not balance, retention. The content that provokes emotion surfaces more frequently. Anger, fear, outrage, validation. Because emotional content keeps you engaged longer. And longer engagement increases profit. But there is a psychological cost. Your perception of reality begins to mirror your feed. If you see constant conflict, you assume constant conflict exists. If you see constant crisis, you assume crisis is permanent. If you see constant polarization, you assume society is irreparably divided. Your emotional state becomes synchronized with your content stream. And when millions of people consume similarly engineered streams, collective mood shifts. This is attention shaping at scale. Now consider how this affects autonomy. When your attention is constantly redirected, your priorities shift. You feel busy, informed, connected, but ask yourself, how often do you choose what to focus on? And how often does something choose for you? Attention is finite. If it is consumed by endless scrolling, it cannot be invested elsewhere. Not in long-term planning, not in skill development, not in critical investigation, not in meaningful organization. A distracted population is easier to predict, easier to manage, because distraction limits depth, and depth creates independence. There is another layer: emotional conditioning. When your posts receive validation, dopamine reinforces the behavior. You learn what kind of content earns approval. You adjust your tone, your opinions, your presentation. Gradually, you optimize yourself for engagement. Even unconsciously, you begin expressing thoughts in ways that fit algorithmic preference. Shorter, sharper, more extreme, more reactive. Nuance doesn't trend. Subtlety doesn't spread quickly. So communication compresses into emotionally charged fragments. This reshapes discourse itself. And discourse shapes perception. It becomes difficult to hold complex ideas in public. Difficult to speak cautiously. Difficult to admit uncertainty. Because uncertainty doesn't reward well. And over time, behavior adapts to reward structures. That is operant conditioning. The scale. The system does not need to silence you. It simply rewards certain expressions more than others. And humans naturally move toward reward. Now imagine billions of people inside this loop. Constant stimulation, constant feedback, constant interruption. The result is a society with reduced attention spans and heightened emotional volatility. Quick to react, slow to analyze, easily redirected. This is not dystopian fiction. It is behavioral economics meeting digital architecture. But here is the most subtle consequence. When you are perpetually stimulated, silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels empty. Deep thought feels effortful. And without stillness, self-awareness declines. Without self-awareness, external influence increases. Because if you are never alone with your thoughts, you rarely examine where they originate. Attention control is not about forcing beliefs into your mind. It is about limiting the mental space available for independent belief formation. If your cognitive bandwidth is consumed, it cannot be used to challenge the system consuming it. That is the elegance of dopamine engineering. You are not restrained. You are entertained. You are not silenced. You are stimulated. And stimulation feels like freedom. But freedom without focus is fragile. Because focus determines direction. And direction determines outcome. Now pause. When was the last time you sat in complete silence, without reaching for a device? When was the last time you read something long enough to feel discomfort? When was the last time you allowed boredom to exist without eliminating it instantly? Boredom used to be a gateway to creativity, to reflection, to innovation. Now it is treated as a problem to solve immediately. But boredom is space, and space allows independent thought. Attention control removes that space, and without space, autonomy shrinks. This chapter is not about rejecting technology. It is about recognizing architecture. The systems you use are designed to keep you engaged. That is their purpose. But awareness shifts the dynamic. When you notice the impulse to check your phone, pause. When a notification interrupts deep focus, decide intentionally whether to respond. When content provokes immediate emotion, slow down before reacting. Because every second of reclaimed attention strengthens cognitive independence. And cognitive independence weakens external influence. In the final chapter, we move into the deepest layer of all. Not fear, not division, not limited choice, not engineered attention, but something even more powerful. The moment when control becomes internal. When you begin regulating yourself, policing your own thoughts, and once control moves inside the mind, it becomes almost invisible and almost impossible to detect until you look closely. 5. Identity manipulation and self-censorship. The most effective control is not imposed. It is internalized. It does not require force. It does not require surveillance cameras on every corner. It does not require constant punishment, because eventually you monitor yourself. And when that happens, control becomes almost invisible. This is the final layer, the deepest one. Identity. Human beings don't just hold beliefs. They build identities around them. I believe this slowly becomes, I am this. And once a belief fuses with identity, it stops being an idea. It becomes part of the self. Now disagreement feels personal. Criticism feels like attack. Contradictory evidence feels threatening. Because it's no longer challenging a position. It's challenging who you are. This is where influence becomes extraordinarily powerful. If narratives can be tied to identity, they become self-defending. You no longer need external enforcement. People will defend the narrative on their own. Aggressively, passionately, emotionally. Think about how often modern discourse revolves around identity categories. Political identity, cultural identity, generational identity, lifestyle identity. Each one offers belonging, community, validation, and belonging is one of the strongest human drives. Isolation once meant death in early human tribes, so the fear of social exclusion runs deep inside the nervous system. When beliefs are connected to belonging, questioning them carries social risk. You may lose status, approval, community, so instead of examining ideas openly, many people protect them instinctively. Not because they are unintelligent, but because social survival feels more urgent than abstract truth. This is where self-censorship begins. At first, it's subtle. You hesitate before expressing an unpopular opinion. You soften your words. You avoid certain topics entirely. You sense the invisible boundaries, and you adjust. No one forces you. You simply calculate the cost. Reputation damage, public shaming, professional consequences, loss of friendships. So you remain silent, or you align publicly with safer narratives. Over time, this calculation becomes automatic. You filter thoughts before they reach your lips. You edit sentences before they leave your mind. And eventually, you stop thinking certain thoughts altogether. Not because they were disproven, but because they were socially expensive. This is psychological containment at its highest level. Because when individuals regulate their own expression, external enforcement becomes unnecessary. The system sustains itself through fear of exclusion, through desire for validation, through identity preservation. There is a powerful psychological phenomenon at work here: cognitive dissonance. When you invest emotionally and socially in a belief, encountering contradictory evidence creates discomfort. The mind seeks relief. One way to relieve it is by rejecting the evidence. Another is by attacking the source. Rarely is the first instinct to calmly reassess identity, because identity feels stable, safe, predictable, and in a rapidly changing world, predictability is comforting. Power structures understand this. They don't always need to invent identities. They simply amplify them, encourage them, reward them. The stronger group identity becomes, the more polarized society grows. And polarization reinforces self-censorship. Because crossing identity lines becomes dangerous. You risk betrayal accusations. You risk losing your tribe. So most people stay inside the psychological borders. And borders, once internalized, are rarely questioned. Now consider how this interacts with everything from the previous chapters. Fear destabilizes. Division fragments. Limited choice constrains. Attention engineering distracts. But identity locks it all in place. Because once control aligns with who you believe you are, it becomes self-sustaining. You defend the system that reinforces your identity. Even if it limits you, even if it manipulates you, even if it exploits your attention, because challenging the system would mean challenging yourself. And that is deeply uncomfortable. This is the most elegant form of control, not oppression.
Participation.
You become both the subject and the enforcer. You monitor your own speech. You correct others. You amplify narratives aligned with your identity. You attack narratives that threaten it. And all of this happens without visible coercion. The cage has no bars, only social consequences. But those consequences feel real. And so behavior adjusts. The tragedy is not that people disagree. Disagreement is natural, healthy, necessary. The tragedy is when disagreement becomes identity warfare, when curiosity dies, when nuance disappears, when complex individuals shrink into simplified labels. And once curiosity disappears, growth stops. Because growth requires the ability to question oneself. Now pause for a moment. How many opinions do you hold that you have deeply re-examined recently? How many beliefs feel uncomfortable to question? Which ideas would cost you socially if you changed your mind? Those pressure points reveal where identity and belief are fused. This chapter is not about abandoning conviction. It is about separating self-worth from ideology. Because when your value as a person depends on never being wrong, you stop evolving. And stagnant minds are easier to predict, easier to influence, easier to guide. Self-censorship does not always look like silence. Sometimes it looks like repetition, repeating approved ideas, sharing safe opinions, echoing the dominant narrative of your group. It feels like participation, but it may simply be alignment. Alignment is rewarded. Deviation is punished. Slowly, the spectrum of acceptable thought narrows. And few notice, because the narrowing happens inside. The final layer of psychological control is this. When people fear being alone more than being incorrect. When belonging outweighs truth. When identity outweighs curiosity. At that point, power no longer needs to push. It only needs to maintain the emotional environment. Fear of exclusion. Reward of validation. Tribal reinforcement, and the system runs itself. But here is the fracture in the mechanism. Awareness. The moment you recognize identity attachment, you create distance. The moment you allow yourself to question without self-condemnation, you expand. The moment you tolerate temporary social discomfort in pursuit of clarity, you regain autonomy. Freedom of thought does not begin with rebellion. It begins with honesty. Honesty about your reactions, your defensiveness, your emotional triggers, because once you can observe them, they no longer fully control you. And that is where this entire journey leads. From fear, to division, to constrained choice, to engineered attention, to internalized control. The battlefield was never only external. It was cognitive, emotional, psychological. But here is the truth they rarely emphasize. Human awareness evolves, and systems that depend on unconscious influence weaken when consciousness rises. The moment you pause before reacting, the moment you question before sharing, the moment you detach identity from ideology, you loosen the grip. Not completely, but enough to think independently. And independent thinking is the one thing no system can fully automate. Control thrives in darkness, but awareness introduces light, and light changes behavior. The question is no longer whether influence exists. It always has. The question is whether you participate unconsciously or observe consciously, because once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend it isn't there. And that is where real autonomy begins.